So the title of the conference is Whose Crisis? Taking Responsibility for Global Education. This fits very well with the idea that we have in the room and amongst our speakers the views emanating from two Bretton Woods institutions for development. The World Bank, of course part of the UN system, along with UNESCO, which hosts the Global Monitoring Report. These are two agencies then that have had, I think now, 60 to 70 years experience of investing in education and development, and therefore must have a great deal of interesting insight into, as they say, what works and what doesn't work. We've got to look backwards as well as look forwards during this conference this morning and see how these two reports relate to each other. They are different animals. The World Development Report, I think this is the first and only one on education. There was a policy paper in 1996, famously, and there have been several others. But this is a big deal, at least in terms of education and development, to see that the World Development Report is focused on that. Global Monitoring Report starts in 2001 and has about 14 or 15 issues, whatever it is now, and we have a former director in the room. So it has a history, it has momentum, and it's not trying to do everything at once because it's done it for 15 occasions. So we have to see the reports and what they say in the light of those structural differences. I think when I was ruminating about this and wondering about both the title and its substance, my mind returned to an old colleague, a man called Philip Coombs. Phil Coombs was the first director of the International Institute for Educational Planning. He wrote a very well-known book in 1967, which was called The World Education Crisis. The first reaction to that from many people was, what crisis? They didn't see the crisis. I think in 1967, the development world was full of elites who had a rather restricted vision and certainly not a lot of data on what was happening out there. And they could say things like that. But by the time Phil wrote an update of that book in 1985, which was the same title, The View from the 80s, he was saying pretty much what is now what you might call the Washington consensus on this subject. And I really do recommend you read that book if you're interested in this subject, and put it alongside the WDR and put it alongside the GEMR and say, what's different? In 1985, Phil was saying preschool is the most important thing you can do. We now seem to have discovered it. He was saying learning matters. Of course, access matters first, because if you don't have access, you don't have the opportunity to learn. But really, the access doesn't matter unless you are learning. I did my PhD on schooling, was not learning, in the 1970s. We had a big project for 10 years around issues to do with what we called the diploma disease. The idea that learning is distorted by assessment, and that if the assessment tail wags the curriculum dog, you're going to be in trouble. Now, whether that's true or not now, I don't know. Some of us may have celebrated this morning when we heard that I think 8 OECD countries had decided not to take part in PISA, on those parts of PISA which try to measure tolerance. Tolerance is a very difficult thing to measure. It's a co-construction that only exists in relation to other people. If the people aren't there, you can't really say that it's a separate and independent trait. These things quickly get quite complicated, but it's extremely significant that a group of OECD countries say, no, we can do maths and science, but please don't start assessing how we feel about you, or telling us what our history is, or looking at what you think global citizenship is when we don't have citizenship. All these questions, I think, are embedded in these two reports in one way or another. Certainly in the interaction between what may be a theory of change for education and development, but I have to say it's not very transparent in either of the reports from my point of view. I don't know what the theory of change is, but I know there ought to be one. So with that, as a very quick introduction and a bit of a tease, many of the people I work with at different levels when they get a report, they say three things. They say, what's new? They say, what have we learned from the past? If you write a report that doesn't learn from the past, of course you're condemned to repeat it. And thirdly, what do we do? Those are the three questions I have in my mind when I think about these reports. And of course I hope, and I'm sure, our speakers will enlighten us on that as we go through the day.